Ancient lost artifacts, legendary weapons, armor, jewelry, stuff of tales and legends, and also some pretty well-known, well-proven artifacts that have simply been lost to time. Have they been destroyed? Have they been lost? Are they being kept somewhere secret? We will explore all of these artifacts and more, so if you're watching this, grab a drink. My choice today is English tea with a little bit of maple syrup in, and while you're here, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you like this sort of thing, as I am trying to hit 1 million subscribers by the end of today. Some say it's too optimistic of a goal, I say I have faith in all of you guys, but join me as we explore the legendary artifact Iceberg. To start off tier 1, we have the Ark of the Covenant. So this is something that most likely everyone has heard of before, hence it being in the first tier, but it was and has been a fascinating mystery for millennia now. And it was basically a storage box or a chest built by the Israelites, and this was at God's instruction with God's specifications for the box, and Moses was instructed to build this ark to a length of 2.5 cubits with a width of 1.5 cubits and also a height of 1.5 cubits. Now I know what you're asking, what the hell is a cubit? But it was basically an old type of measurement, and in modern units that's like 52 inches length by 31 inches height by 31 inches depth. And I know what you might be saying, Connor, we don't all use inches. Can't you just use a normal measurement like everyone else? And okay, fine. It was about 13 tailless gerbils in length and about 7 3/4 tailless gerbils in height and depth. And it had to be made out of acacia wood. Then it was to be covered or gilded in gold, have these 4 golden rings attached at either end of it, with these 2 gold-covered poles put through the holes. And then with these poles, you'd be able to, carry the ark without actually touching it. And as far as touching the ark goes, I mean, what are you, stupid? Of course you can't touch it. Anyone who touched the ark in the Bible was instantly struck down by the wrath of God. You touch it, just die instantly on the spot. And the Israelites at the time, after they built the ark, they kind of used it to transport and store all of their most important artifacts. And so the artifact of the ark, the legend of it, isn't just the ark itself, it's also everything inside of the ark. And I realize there might be some confusion between Noah's ark and Moses's ark. This ark was a chest, Noah's ark was a giant boat, very different things. But this ark was kind of used to inspire the Israelites. It was kind of a symbol of their power and right to be and do whatever they were being and doing. And they took it on them through these long treks in the desert and the wilderness. And if you were a poor, struggling Israelite in the desert at the time, you would probably see this ark, this gleaming, golden, holy thing, and it would probably give you some hope, some inspiration, and apparently it also granted them protection. So you can imagine it channeling the power of God, and while they were out in the wilderness, it gave them protection. When they were crossing rivers, it sometimes, parted the river a little bit, and they famously took the ark to the siege of Jericho, which there is some evidence to suggest that Jericho was already destroyed by the time the Israelites got there. But according to the biblical account, the Israelites went to Jericho, and Jericho had these huge impenetrable walls. But after taking the ark and marching around the city 6 times, accompanied by 7 priests blowing 7 trumpets, as soon as they completed the 7th rotation around Jericho, instantly the walls just collapsed. And then the Israelites were able to, go into Jericho and basically invade, kill the Jerichonians, take over the city, and the legend says it was all thanks to the power of this ark. And if you notice, there's quite an importance on the number 7 there. And the ark in these stories kind of pops up here and there. It is quite fun to track kind of where it is at any one given point in time. But in one of these accounts, the Israelites lost the Battle of Ebenezer, and my pronunciation is uncertain on that one, but they lost the battle versus the Philistines, which was another tribe, another group of people back then. And the Philistines worshipped these pagan gods such as Dagon and Astarte. And interestingly enough, we actually get the name Beelzebub from one of the Philistine gods. So the Israelites basically took the god of another person and then made it into a name for the devil in their religion. So that was kind of interesting. But the Philistines were quite a warlike people. They were strong, they were competent, they were hard-headed, and they may have actually originated from another peoples which we covered before, the remnants of the sea people. And so the Israelites lost this battle, and as a secret tactic, as this backup weapon they had. They brought to the next battle the Ark. And surely with the power of God in this Ark, they couldn't lose, which means, of course, that they did lose that battle. And the Philistines killed a bunch of the Israelites. They took the Ark for themselves. And the Israelites in this battle lost an estimated 30,000 soldiers, which is an insane amount of people to lose, especially for the populations back then. But when word that the Ark was captured got back to the other Israelites, apparently one of the elder priests, Eli, just instantly dropped dead, like on the spot. But the Philistines, while celebrating their victory, found that wherever they stored the Ark, bad things happened. You know, there was either mass destruction of their gods' statues, or plagues or illnesses came over a bunch of people in certain areas. And they kept just moving the Ark, bad things would happen over here, then they moved it again, more bad things would happen. And so they were like, this is ridiculous, we just can't get rid of this curse. And so they eventually handed it back to the Israelites after only 7 months, and again, there's that 7 number. But they gave it back to the Israelites along with these golden statues as a way of saying, like, hey buddy, we're sorry about taking the Ark, sorry about killing thousands of your people. Here's some gold to make up for it. And it should be noted that this account comes from the Hebrew Bible, so it is most likely at least a little bit biased. But the Ark kind of stays around for a few more years until it is eventually housed in Jerusalem. And during the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 587 BC, the city was more or less burnt, and the whereabouts of the Ark after this are seemingly completely unknown. The three main beliefs or theories is that the Babylonians either took it back to Babylon, or the people of Jerusalem hid the Ark somewhere in Jerusalem, maybe in a secret underground vault, or perhaps just buried it underground, as they were being sieged for like 3 years, so they did have plenty of time to really hide it if they wanted to. And so in this theory, it's still somewhere beneath Jerusalem, as it wasn't taken away and it wasn't destroyed. Or a third theory says that they smuggled it out of the city at some point during the siege, and they took it to who knows where. Some theories say they took it down to Africa through Egypt. Others say they took it up into Europe, so it's either in Spain or France or maybe even over an island. And others say they took it somewhere into Asia, which I think might be the most far-fetched theory, because they didn't really have any safe connections in which to, you know, transport it up there and to bury it or house it somewhere that it hasn't turned up by now. And yeah, stuff like this is always a super fascinating topic for me. I can and have gone down into the rabbit hole for this for like hours on end. So if you like stuff like this, firstly, stay tuned. Secondly, go on a rabbit hunt of your own if you want. But yeah, we have no idea where the Ark is or if it even still exists to this day. The Philosopher's Stone. So this was this ancient mythical item, sometimes in the form of a powder or liquid, but most often in the form of a stone, and it could transform these boring base metals like, you know, zinc, copper, mercury. It could transform them into gold and silver. And as well as that, it could also prolong life, cure illnesses or ailments, cure plants or trees, transform basically normal boring crystals into rare gems, and some of my favorite abilities, create flexible glass, everlasting lamps, and tiny clone people, which, I mean, that is one hell of a stone. But this was basically the ultimate goal or aim for all alchemists for like thousands of years. And the earliest mention of this stone goes all the way back to around 2000 BC. And many alchemists, especially religious ones, believed that the stone's first ever owner and user was actually Adam from the Bible, and that he received this knowledge and this stone from God. And with this stone, he was able to prolong life, and that explains why so many of the people in the Bible live for like really, really long. And then it was passed down generation to generation until maybe it slowly started to lose some of its power, or it eventually got lost, and then it just faded away into a thing of legends, kind of like the One Ring in Lord of the Rings. And the Philosopher's Stone, or something very similar to it, has seen mentions in loads of religions, from Christianity to Islam, Judaism, but also notably Hinduism, but also in many, many cultures. But the fact remains, if it ever did exist, if it still exists to this day, we have no idea where it is. The Holy Grail was the cup or grail that Jesus supposedly drank out of during the Last Supper before his execution. And according to the account, this grail wasn't like anything special. It wasn't like a golden grail filled with gems or something. It was just a normal, boring cup. But what made it special was that Jesus himself used it. And while it has been rumored to have popped up all over the place throughout the years, with lots of people claiming that they have the real genuine Grail. There's no super concrete evidence to say that it even existed, or to say that it still exists today, and if it does exist today, there's no evidence to say which one of these claims is actually the real one. So, a very cool artifact, but we may never find it. Jesus's burial cloth, or the Shroud of Turin, was this cloth said to date back to the time of Jesus, and it had this vague image or outline of Christ, which apparently can be seen more easily when the image is turned negative and the contrast is bumped up a whole bunch. But according to the legend, this cloth was wrapped around Jesus at the time of his death, and he was buried in it in his tomb, and his blood is what caused this holy image to appear. There is, however, some evidence to suggest that this cloth was made in the 12 or 1300s, and the blood is not blood, but rather red pigment. But it is still an ancient relic of our past. Excalibur, and oh boy, this is a fun one. And the whole Merlin, Arthur, Excalibur myth first officially started round about the 1200s with Robert de Boron's French poem titled Merlin, in which Merlin in the story tells the tale of Arthur, who comes along and pulls this sword out of an anvil on Christmas Eve, and with that becomes the true and rightful king of the Britons. But there are so many texts and tales and stories about this round about this time, you know, like the 1100s up to the 1400s, in which the tale of Arthur and Excalibur are seemingly slowly built up bit by bit all over the place, with the prophecies of Merlin being written in the 1100s, followed by a reference to his full name being Merlinus Ambrosius, and this links back to an old man, wizard, sage sort of character that was mentioned 300 years before this in the year roughly 900, named Ambrosius. So the idea of Merlin dates back at least this far. And there's a 6th century Welsh reference to a crazy old man prophet named Merlin, written in, you know, Celtic Welsh. And this seems to be where the name Merlin was derived from, you know, the 6th century, but it likely goes back even further than that, maybe before it was named Merlin at all. I'm sure the wise old man myth has been around for millennia. So then we come to the story of Merlin telling about Arthur pulling the sword out of the anvil, and at this point it wasn't Excalibur, and then in later retellings it becomes Excalibur that was pulled out of the anvil, which by this point the story has evolved to be pulling out of a stone, and then in some versions of the story Excalibur is the sword that is given to Arthur by the lady in the lake, and the name Excalibur itself comes from the names Caliburnus or Chaliburn, or the Celtic Welsh Calad Fort. So Arthur, Merlin, Excalibur, they all have these ancient origins. We can't really pinpoint it to any one, you know, point. But the sword itself is said to possess the power of light, blinding enemies whenever it's drawn, and the scabbard, or sheath, or sword holster, is said to protect the user from being wounded. And, I mean, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. And Arthur really shouldn't have expected to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at him. You know, if anyone else had claimed themselves to be emperor, just because some moistened bint threw a scimitar at them, they'd probably get locked away. But legend has it that King Arthur will rise again, and return when Albion or Britain's need is greatest. But until that day, all we can do is wait. Crystal skulls. So these are a type of artifact that date apparently all the way back to the Mesoamerica era, and these are normally in the Aztec or Mayan civilizations before the arrival of Columbus. And they are these ancient, mystical, apparently magical artifacts resembling human skulls. And while these ancient civilizations do have a lot of things depicting skulls, you know, they decorate things with skulls, they're kind of comfortable with skulls, there's not a ton of evidence to show that they ever really used or made crystal skulls. And so a lot of these are thought, at least in the modern day, to be 1800s productions, crafted somewhere in Europe to be sold as these ancient mystical artifacts. But others believe that they are actually alien artifacts, or alien skulls, or gifts from aliens perhaps. You know, maybe the aliens took this human skull, shot a laser at it, transformed it into glass or crystal, and then gave it back to the humans as a little gift. How nice of them. And maybe these skulls still have powers. Maybe they just originally had powers and it's kind of seeped out of them, so it's just a boring crystal skull now. And another theory was that the crystal skulls that we currently have are just 1800s replicas, but they were inspired by genuine crystal skulls that are seemingly no longer around. So there were these ancient magical crystal skulls. In the 1800s, they either heard of them or they saw them, they reproduced these copies, and now there's just so many of these copies everywhere, and the original magical crystal skulls have either been destroyed or lost or buried somewhere underground. And yeah, so there are a lot of theories for this one, and I think even if they're not real, they do look pretty cool. Tier 2, Holy Lance. So the Holy Lance, also known as the Spear of Longinus, was the spear that was apparently stabbed into the side of Jesus as he was being crucified. And the name Longinus was apparently the name of the Roman soldier who had the spear. And it doesn't actually come from the Bible, but it comes from the Gospel of Nicodemus, who named this soldier as Longinus. And while it is in theory a holy relic, I think it exists probably more in the minds of people, because if you think to back then, and this is just assuming that, you know, Jesus existed and he died on the cross and all that. But if you're a Roman or a Roman soldier, there wasn't really much importance to Jesus at the time. So if this stabbing did happen, they probably stabbed him in the side, and then this was just, you know, a random spear. Either they went on using it, or they destroyed it, or recycled it, or something. Like, the significance of Jesus really came quite a while after his death. So sadly, I think if this event did occur, the spear is most likely lost to time. It was never stored or saved. But that hasn't stopped, you know, multiple holy lances apparently appearing. People say they have either fragments of the lance or the entire lance itself. But as I said, I do kind of doubt these claims. So the true cross, as you might imagine, refers to the actual cross that Jesus was crucified on. And this legend said that in the years roughly around 300, Saint Helena, who was the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, she traveled to Jerusalem, and there, while she was looking around, while she was exploring, she found 3 crosses. One was the cross of Jesus, and the other 2 were the 2 people that he was apparently crucified with, Dismas and Justus. But on the back of one of the crosses was carved the name of Jesus, and so she knew that this was Jesus's cross. At first she kind of doubted it apparently, but then these miracles started to happen with the cross, and that convinced her that this truly was the cross of Jesus. And there have been some interesting theories about this cross over the years. One of them being that the cross that Jesus was crucified on was made out of wood that originally came from the tree in the Garden of Eden. You know, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the one famously that caused Adam and Eve to be banished from the garden. And as with a bunch of the other artifacts, there are a ton of people, a ton of claims to having the real true cross. And these are mainly fragments, although their claims are, you know, a little tentative. They're quite hard to verify. And the results for any tests done on them do come back a bit questionable, but it would be pretty cool to know where the cross was today, if in fact it was ever kept whole. Jesus's crucifixion nails is, you guessed it, another relic from Jesus's life or death, and this were the nails that were used to crucify him on the cross. And there are some differing beliefs on this, on whether there were 3 nails used to crucify him or 4, with those believing that there were 3 nails used being called triclavianists, which I'm not even joking, that is a classification of belief. And it was apparently Saint Helena, once again, who found these nails. You know, she found the cross, she found the nails as well, she took them back to Constantinople. One of the nails was apparently used to make a bridle. One of them was used to make the helmet of Constantine, and the other 1 or 2 nails remaining, we don't really know what happened to them. But both the bridle and the helmet of Constantine are also lost, so no matter which way you swing it, all of the nails are currently missing. But there are, as always, if you look, many people claiming to have the actual nails, but there's only like 4 nails in history, and like 30 different claims to having the true nail, so they can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. Moses's staff is, of course, the staff that Moses used in the story of Exodus to perform certain miracles or acts of God, such as getting water from a rock, parting the Red Sea, triggering all of the plagues of Egypt. And according to legend, the staff was created on the 6th day of creation and was passed down from man to man, from father to son, until it finally came to Moses. And similar to another legend we covered, this staff was apparently stuck in the ground, and this was in Moses' father-in-law's garden, and it was said that whoever could pull this staff out of the ground would be destined to lead Israel out of Egypt. And then we don't really know what happened to it. There are some claims to the staff, such as the one being held and displayed in the Topkapi Palace Museum, and this is in Istanbul, although there are a few other claims in a few different countries, such as the treasury of Saint Chapelle, and the idea was that it was moved from Jerusalem up to Constantinople, and then into France, and then it was held at this chapel. And just looking through all of these artifacts, I want to bring up a point that I brought up earlier about the original artifacts were most likely these boring kind of mundane items, like Longinus's spear. It was just a Roman spear. The Holy Grail was likely just a plain cup. You know, apart from stuff maybe like the Ark of the Covenant, which was covered in gold. Like a lot of the things that were irrelevant in the time that they were, you know, generated or made were, I think, very, very likely just lost to time. I mean, unless the Holy Grail is being used in a coffee shop in Ireland or something. I mean, what do I know? I just make videos on the internet. The Fountain of Youth. So this one isn't necessarily one artifact or place, but rather it's like a concept. And so many civilizations over the years have had concepts like this in some form or another, from Herodotus some 2,500 years ago in Greece, all the way up to the 16th century Caribbean myth of Bimini, and likely countless legends and myths in between those two, probably countless even before that, before written history, and likely a ton since then. And these myths and legends obviously all kind of vary from being a fountain, but they normally include water in some form, so whether that's a magical river or lake or spring, and all of the myths seemingly range in abilities as well, but they all normally do some form of healing, so whether that's healing wounds, whether that's reversing ages or healing diseases, or bringing things back to life, or in a few more quirky cases that I found, dressing people up in fancy clothes who are, you know, dipped in the lake, which pretty nice. And it also appears in the Bible with the idea of Jesus healing someone using this blessed water from the pool of Bethesda, in which an angel had apparently come down, stirred the water, and in stirring the water it put a blessing on the water that the next person to step into it would be cured of anything that afflicted them. The Trojan Horse. So you probably all know of the Trojan Horse, but the details of its legend and history are really quite interesting. The story goes that after a long 10-year siege on the city of Troy, the Greeks eventually gave up and said, fine, whatever, you win, city of Troy. We're just gonna go sail away now. Bye. And so they burnt all of their camps and tents. They built this giant horse as a tribute to the god Athena, and this horse was apparently to bless them for a safe journey home. And then they all got into their boats and sailed away. And when the Greeks were gone, the Trojans kind of peeked around, opened up the gates, saw this horse and blessing that they had left, and wanted to basically remove it, take the blessing for themselves, maybe increase the chances of the Greeks having a bad journey home. And they took this giant horse into their city, closed the gates again, and then come nightfall, secretly, the horse was actually filled with a bunch of some of the best Greek soldiers, and they snuck out of the horse, snuck round, opened the gates, and the rest of the Greek army didn't actually sail back. You know, earlier they got into their boats, they made it look like they were sailing away, and then when it hit night, they turned around, came back, and now the gates of Troy were open. So needless to say, the Greeks went into the city of Troy, you know, killed all the people, destroyed it. And apparently one of the reasons that they made the horse so big, that the Greeks wanted to give this impression that the horse and the blessing was so big, it was too big to move, you know, basically making a statement, this is our blessing, we're gonna make it so big that you have zero chance of moving it, so you had better not take this into your city when we leave. And then the Trojans were like, you know what, we are going to take it into our city. And that was part of the story. Or so the legend goes. There have also been some historical accounts to suggest that this horse wasn't really a horse. You know, it wasn't a giant horse wooden figure, but rather it was a large ship. And the evidence for this is that the language used to describe the men getting into the horse is often the same language that's used to describe men boarding boats. So they thought this could have been a boat instead. And boats are pretty big, and they're made out of wood, and they were sometimes called seahorses in the day. And also they used to embellish the front of ships with, you know, images or animals, and sometimes that animal was a giant horse head on the front. So that's one of the theories. They left behind a giant wooden ship that kind of got mistranslated over the years and became a giant wooden horse. Or some theories say that this wasn't a giant wooden horse, but it was actually a giant wooden siege engine, because back in the day, siege engines were pretty great, except they had one weakness, and that was that they were made out of wood. So they were quite susceptible to flames, to flaming arrows, and so often they used to use this dampened horsehide to, buffer, to cover the siege engine in it. And so the idea of it being a giant wooden horse, horsehide, perhaps they had used this giant wooden horse to gain entry into the city, either, once again, by just smashing and destroying the walls, or by doing that same sailing away trick, leaving it there. And Troy thought, alright, let's collect everything they left behind. Oh look, a cool looking siege engine. I'll just take this over into the city, and then bam, tricked. Bamboozled. Or another theory, and we're kind of running out of theories here, but another theory says that this horse was actually an earthquake that destroyed Troy. So, an earthquake happened, it destroyed the walls of Troy, thus allowing the Greeks to enter. And this is partly due to Poseidon being the god of sea, so, the Greeks sailing away, and the god of horses, so the Trojan horse, and also the god of earthquakes. So again, this might have been a translation sort of thing, where an earthquake caused it, so then people started to say that Poseidon caused it, and then other people were like, hey, Poseidon, isn't that the god of horses? So you're saying a horse caused the collapse of Troy? And then, a rumor here, a whisper there, and the story all kind of gets mixed up. And there was archaeological evidence to show that the city of Troy had at some point been heavily damaged by an earthquake. So this theory isn't necessarily as terrible or crazy as it sounds. But if the horse ever did exist, where is it today? It's very, very, very hard to say. If you want my honest opinion, it probably got dismantled for lumber, as most boats and stuff tended to do in those days. You can't just leave good wood to go to waste. But that is the story of the Trojan horse. In tier 3, we have the crown of thorns. So according to the biblical account, this was a crown made out of thorns and placed on Jesus' head as he was being crucified. And this was both to mock him and to inflict pain on him, with the idea being the Romans like, oh yeah, you say you're king? You say you're the Lord? Alright, well, here's your crown we made for you. Hope you like wearing it, sort of thing. And there are some accounts of a thorn of crowns being kept and venerated in the, first few hundred years after Jesus' death. And according to these accounts, it was likely kept in the city of Jerusalem by some of his followers. It was then purportedly moved to the city of Constantinople after a few more hundred years. And then it stayed there for a few hundred years before being offered by the Emperor of Constantinople to King Louis IX of France in 1238. And this was seemingly the gift of like a dying empire. And while in France, it was kept in the Notre Dame Cathedral. And this was its longest stretch of time, from around the 1200s all the way up to 2019, when Notre Dame went up in flames and the crown ended up actually surviving, and it was moved for safekeeping, and then it was eventually replaced back into Notre Dame. And it was actually moved back there in December 2024, so like a few weeks ago, which is pretty cool. But this is the most convincing account and trace of an actual crown of thorns that we have. And interestingly enough, multiple thorns have actually been taken out of this crown of thorns over the years, and they have been gifted to various countries, especially in Europe, and there's even a thorn over in the United States of America. So a pretty cool one. I like that there's a decent paper trail for this one, and the gifting of these thorns represents kind of like a peace offering sort of thing. So I do like the idea of spreading out the love. The Veil of Veronica. So this is an ancient relic, this piece of cloth that was apparently given to Jesus as he was walking along, as he was bearing his cross, and it was used to wipe the sweat off Jesus's brow. And when it was returned to her, apparently it bore the face of Jesus. And there are records of this cloth being kept in the church, being safeguarded for at least 1,000 years. And while there are various other claims to this artifact, like one in Vienna, one in Alicante, one in Jaén, this one is the most widely known, the best believed one, and is held in the Vatican and brought out once a year for people to look upon. And a quick note about this cloth is said to heal illnesses, to cure blindness, to bring people back from the dead, as well as many more miracles, which begs the question, why in the flying fuggle is this cloth not being brought out and shown around the world every single day? You know, within a few months, we would completely cure blindness, cure every single disease, and I don't really have a good answer for that. Confederate Gold is an entry we covered in one of the bloody icebergs. There's so many now. Mystery Iceberg, Alternate History Iceberg. It was probably one of those. But this refers to the huge amount of gold and treasuries that went missing after the Civil War. And it all started with the soon-to-be evacuated New Orleans. And with the North approaching, the authorities advised everyone to just take all of your gold. And this was wealthy people, banks, insurance companies. They said, if you keep it here, the North is going to come, they're going to confiscate everything, so it's your best bet to move it out of the city. So most of them did. They took all of their gold, their silver, which was hundreds of millions of dollars worth in today's money, and they sent it via General Beauregard to the Georgian Iron Bank, where he assured it would be kept safe. Then, shortly afterwards, Beauregard received an email. Beauregard received a telegram telling him to go into the bank where he had just deposited all of this stuff and to withdraw all of this gold and silver. And when the president of the Iron Bank refused to give it to him because he said it wasn't his, it belonged to the people of New Orleans, Beauregard was instructed to just take it by force. And then the Secretary of War, General Randolph, instructed him to deliver it to the government depository in Georgia. And in Beauregard's own words, what became of that coin is, we believe, even to this day, a mystery. It was doubtless spent for the benefit of the Confederacy, but how and to what purpose, not having been regularly appointed by the Congress, has never been known to the South, especially to the stockholders and depositors of the Bank of Louisiana. So, was it used for the Confederacy in some manner, or was it stolen by either the Confederacy or by the North? Was it buried somewhere, or hidden, or forgotten about? And this is hundreds of millions of dollars, I might remind you. But as Beauregard said, we really have no idea what happened to it. The Ark of Noah was, as you all likely know, the ark or giant ship that Noah built to protect his family, to protect a bunch of animals from the worldwide flood that God apparently caused on the earth. And if you think this was just like a regular sized boat, no. People have calculated that given the estimated measurements for this, it could have housed roughly 2.15 million sheep, or sheep-sized animals, and the measurements for the ark were quite religiously significant, with the heights of each deck representing Israeli temples, and the compartments representing heaven, earth, hell, or, the underworld essentially. And partly because of the large amount of flood stories that we see in other cultures, in other civilizations, a few of which actually outdate the Old Testament, like for example Gilgamesh. It is commonly believed among archaeologists that this didn't actually happen, but it was more like a metaphor, a story, an allegory for God and his power and his will, etc. But also for his mercy, telling Noah, allowing Noah to build the ship, saving Noah and his family and a bunch of animals, and also with the ship representing the Israelis and their faith in God, because the ark was built with no steering wheel, so it was just floating around in the water, basically being steered by God's will. And so again, with this one, we're not entirely sure it even existed in the first place, but a lot of people do believe it did exist, and it is maybe buried somewhere, but we just don't know where. The Roswell Debris. So I don't know why this is in the legendary artifacts iceberg, probably because it's one of the most well-known major alien UFO encounters. And if you do like alien encounters, I have one hell of a video for you here. It's over 8 hours of alien encounters, UFOs, theories. Mwah. Perfect. But the Roswell incident happened in 1947 when this thing, disc, object, whatever, was seen flying around the sky. And then later, it apparently crashed in a nearby farm. And the owner of this farmland reported this to the local police. They then reported it to the Roswell Army Air Force, or the RAAF. And they came along, they collected the debris, and they issued a press release saying that they had recovered a flying disc from this site, which obviously made massive headlines at the time. And so very shortly after, the army came out and issued another press release saying that this wasn't a flying disc that they recovered. It was instead a fallen weather balloon. And at the time, it seemed like everyone was kind of okay with that. For the most part, they were like, oh, okay, it's a weather balloon, crashed, whatever. But then, 30 years later, this man, Major Jesse Marcel, came out and said, look, this entire thing, it was one big cover-up. We hoaxed the whole thing. He said that it was a flying saucer that we went out there to recover, and every worker out there knew that this was the case, but they were told, act as if it's a weather balloon. Even these photos with Marcelin were apparently staged. They got this weather balloon material, they made it look like it was debris, but the actual flying disc that they recovered was never photographed, at least not publicly. And these are where the conspiracies basically come from about them capturing this flying craft and taking it to a secret underground base, Area 51 or something. But as I said, if you're interested in this stuff, check out my Alien Iceberg. I cover God knows how many cases in that. And, while I've got you here, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. We're still a few short of the 1 million subscriber goal, I think, by the end of the day. Or do whatever you want to do. I'm not your dad. The Robe of Jesus is, you may have guessed, a robe that Jesus was said to have worn shortly before his crucifixion. And what was special about this robe was, obviously, it was worn by Jesus, which made it special, but also it was a robe without seams. So after Jesus had died, the Romans took the robe and they were gonna cut it up by, the seams and divide it out, but because it didn't have seams, they decided not to separate it. And so that is, as the legend says, partly why it remains in one piece to this day. It was discovered by none other than Saint Helena, who, as you might remember, also discovered the Holy Cross and the Holy Nails. And so according to the legend, Helena discovered it in the year 300, and there wasn't really much record of it up until the 1100s, when it was written about in Trier, Germany. And it's a bit of a strange piece. It's had multiple modifications made to it over the years, with bits of taffeta and silk being sewed into it, likely in an attempt to, keep it whole, to repair any damages to it. And it was also dipped in some sort of rubber substance in the 1800s, again likely in a misguided attempt to kind of preserve it. But this dipping in rubber has likely removed any chance of scientists, properly aging the item. And originally this robe wasn't shown to anyone. It was taken, it was folded up neatly, it was kept in secret in this cathedral. But in the 1500s, Emperor Maximilian basically came to this cathedral. He demanded to be shown this robe, and so they took it out and they showed him. But then all of the locals were like, hey, why did he get to see it? We want to see the robe as well. And so the cathedral arranged like a yearly viewing of this, which wasn't always kept to. It was changed eventually to a 7-yearly viewing, and then it was changed to just whenever the cathedral decided to, I guess. And there is rumored to be a viewing in 2033 celebrating the 2000th anniversary of Jesus' death, which that sounds a bit weird, celebrating a death, but the date could possibly change, and it is still just a rumor. So if you want to go and see this robe, definitely keep an eye out for their updates. The Buddha's relics. So according to the scripture, the Buddha ordered his followers to, after his death, cremate him and to take all of his remains, all of his ashes, and all of his belongings and all of his scriptures and distribute them into these tiny little buildings or shrines called stupas. So over time they apparently did this. They took his ashes, his bones, his teeth, his skull fragments, as well as his belongings, his robe, his bowl, his staff, and supposedly a king, King Ashoka, was able to divide all of these things and distribute them into over 84,000 stupas and shrines, with these stupas basically representing Buddha's presence. And an interesting part about this was that the Buddha was said to experience 3 deaths in relation to him and his being. So one, nirvana, was when he reached enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, which was the death of all of his potential future rebirths. One was when he actually physically died, which was obviously the death of his mind and body. And another will apparently occur where all of Buddha's remains, all of his knowledge, all of his quotes, his teachings, all of that is destroyed. And when no living being remembers Buddha, speaks about Buddha, knows the name, just when he is forgotten completely among the entire universe, then and only then will this 3rd nirvana occur, where all of his relics will, revive. The Buddha himself will kind of come back to life. His body will be restored. He will fly back to the exact spot he reached this 1st nirvana, under the Bodhi tree, and he will sit there in the lotus position and once more emit these beams of light that illuminate 10,000 worlds. He will be worshipped one last time by the gods, and then finally burst into flames and disappear for all eternity. At least that's what the legends say. Tier 4, Abraham's Pot. So this is one of the many artifacts being displayed and stored in the Topkapi Palace Temple in Istanbul, Turkey. And some of the others are the Sword of Muhammad, the Mantle of Muhammad, and his banner and his footprints, and Joseph's turban, the Sword of David, the Staff of Moses, and many more. And this, Abraham's Pot, is said to be the pot that Abraham used as kind of a cooking pot, and that's basically all we have on it. It should be noted that a lot of these artifacts, the Sword of David, Joseph's turban, some of these are incredibly old, they're super hard to verify. The chances of them being passed down safely over the years and not being swapped out, not being hoaxed, not being anything like that is, I think, incredibly low. So believe these if you will, but yeah, Abraham's Pot is just one of the many artifacts, apparent artifacts, kept here. Zulfiqar is the sword of Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, which uniquely has this kind of split at the end of it. And the origin and meaning of this name has been kind of debated over the years. Zulfiqar, it could be a reference to maybe the Orion belt, alluding to maybe the divine nature of this sword. It could also be derived from the words meaning spine splitter, which is quite brutal of a name, but it would probably fit. Or to it being kind of a metaphorical splitter. So this sword, splitting truth from lies, splitting good from evil, and with the wielder, Ali Talib, being able to differentiate these. A bunch of Middle Eastern and Islamic swords have over the years been kind of fashioned like this, I guess in reference to the Zulfiqar, and the imagery appears in decorations, in actual swords as I said, also in paintings, in flags. And as to the actual location of the sword, we don't really know. It's never turned up after some of the initial references to it. It was very likely probably buried, lost, destroyed, and although it may turn up somewhere, perhaps buried in a tomb or something, it hasn't yet to this day, and so we don't really know where it is, or if it still even exists. Palladium. So this was a wildly fascinating artifact whose history dates back all the way to the goddess of Athena, who killed her friend Pallas accidentally, or Pallas, while having a friendly competition with him, and because she felt so guilty about this, she decided to make a statue of herself, which yeah, that's absolutely the correct thing to do. And then this statue then fell from the heavens, landed in the city of Troy, or the land that Troy was built in. And then this statue became a symbol of safety for the city, with it being believed that as long as the statue stayed within the city walls, that the city would forever be safe. And wouldn't you know it, during the Trojan Horse incident, the one we covered earlier, the Greeks actually do manage to get into the city, they get into the temple, and they take this Palladium out of the city, which it is said accelerated the downfall of Troy. Then Aeneas, the legendary defender of Troy, he was able to sneak out, avoid the total destruction of Troy, and take the Palladium along with a bunch of other escaped Trojans with him, and go on a crazy journey across the Mediterranean, visiting kings and powerful people and leaders, and fighting battles until eventually they came to Italy, where eventually they settled down, they placed the Palladium, and then his descendants would eventually found this small, tiny little city that you may have heard of before, that being the city of Rome. And the statue was kept in Rome for likely hundreds of years, protecting the city just as it did protect Troy. And we think that it might have been transferred over to Constantinople, when Constantine moved the Roman capital over there, and then from there he may have buried it somewhere in the city, either under an important building to help with the blessing, or under just some random area in order to keep it safe and keep it more secret. But the evidence for this is all really a bit sketchy, and we really have kind of no idea where it is today. Chinese treasure ships. So for this entry, we need to introduce a man named Admiral Zheng He, and sorry for the pronunciation on that, but he was an admiral, obviously, in the Chinese Ming dynasty of the 1400s. And during this time, he launched several huge naval expeditions, and this was over around 30 years, and the size of these expeditions was just just insane. The ships themselves were often well over 100 meters or 400 feet in length. Some of them contained 3,600 men per ship, and in the first expedition alone, there were 63 ships, meaning roughly 30,000 men. And then the second expedition was roughly 250 ships, so again, likely around 100,000 men on this expedition. And there were 7 voyages in total, and the aim of these was basically to kind of spread the word about China. And it wasn't necessarily to like invade people, but it was more to, you know, go around to trade all of our goods, to buy goods from other places, to put out the word like, yo, China is super powerful. Look at this huge navy we have. You know, do you have this many huge ships? Can you do these huge expeditions? Yeah, didn't think so. So they went around, they made statues, they set up trade agreements, trade deals, they set up routes for themselves, and it was honestly pretty successful. The expeditions soon stopped due to these kind of internal affairs, internal wars in China, and we don't to this day know where any of these ships went. They were likely probably recycled in some form, and the treasure shipyard in Nanjing, where most of these boats were probably built, did eventually just kind of fall into disuse, fall into disrepair. It was kind of forgotten about before eventually being demolished. And there have been shipwrecks of a few of these Chinese ships found like at the bottom of the ocean with all of these goods from all around the world, but these only likely represent just a few of the ships, and I think most of them were probably taken back to China, dismantled, used for other things, changed into, you know, other ships. And it is kind of sad to see them kind of destroyed in this way, but the story of these expeditions was absolutely epic. The Cloak of Muhammad was an artifact that apparently Muhammad wore on his journey from Mecca to Jerusalem in 621 AD. So the legend says after his journey, Muhammad gave his cloak to his friend Hazrat, and he passed it down through generations and generations through his family until it was eventually given to Amar Shah Durrani in 1768. And he is often considered the founder, more or less, of Afghanistan, or at least modern Afghanistan. And they have kept it in the Kirka Sharif shrine in Afghanistan, guarded by the same family for 250 years. And as with a bunch of these artifacts, it has these divine powers, such as healing, bringing good fortune, and warding off evil spirits. King Arthur's Round Table. So this originates from, as we explored before, the whole myth and legends surrounding King Arthur. And King Arthur's court was apparently filled with these famous and skilled warriors and knights. Like some many of you have probably heard of, King Lancelot, or Sir Lancelot, Sir Gawain, Sir Galahad, etc. And the idea was to have this round table, which that's more like a teardrop shape, but you have this round table such that anyone sitting at the table is equally distant to the center of the table as anyone else. So obviously on a normal table, you probably have the head of a table, you know, the most important person, and you have everyone is like slightly further away from the table at different points. But the idea behind this was that everyone in his court was an equal. So he was no more important than any of his knights, and so he had a round table. And I mean, we're not entirely sure if King Arthur even actually existed, but if it did exist, this is one of the relics. We're not entirely sure where the round table is today. Might have been buried, might have been forgotten about, might have been destroyed, or it might in fact never have actually existed. Nanteos Cup. Was this cup, I mean, it's not really being used as a cup anymore with all of these holes, but it was purportedly transported and kept safe. I mean, not too safe with the bloody state of it, but it was said to be a cup made from the wood of Jesus's actual cross. Or some thought that it was the Holy Grail, or some thought that it was both, and that's a bit far-fetched, I think, because how can you have this cup exist before Jesus' death, you know, for him to drink from at the Last Supper, and then for it also to be made of the cross that he was later crucified on? But it was moved around. It was eventually kept in Wales until the 1500s, and then it was snuck out of the abbey that it was kept in during the Catholic Reformation. And this is when churches basically up and down the country were being destroyed, were being looted, mostly under the orders of King Henry VIII. It was then moved to Nanteos, also in Wales, where it remained for apparently almost 400 years, until it was publicly displayed by George Powell in 1878. So a pretty cool little wooden artifact. The Elixir of Life, also known as water. But no, this Elixir of Life was first mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is an old story, some like 4,000 years ago, where Gilgamesh starts to kind of worry about his own mortality, and so he seeks out a man called Utnapishtim, who was basically this early inspiration for Noah, with Utnapishtim being instructed to build a giant ark, or a giant boat, to load all of his family onto, as well as a bunch of animals. And this was because one of the gods was flooding the entire earth because he was kind of sick of humans. And so this basically kills all of mankind except for Utnapishtim. The flood lasts for 6 days and 6 nights, and then that's basically the end of the flood. He gets out of the boat and is rewarded by the gods with immortality because of his faith and devotion. But anyway, Gilgamesh is afraid of death, so he seeks out Utnapishtim, who is still alive because he's now immortal, and he asks him about immortality, to which he instructs Gilgamesh to dive down to the bottom of the ocean and to retrieve this special plant. And so Gilgamesh goes into the ocean, dives all the way down. He finds this plant, but this bloody, slippery snake serpent of the sea takes it and consumes it before Gilgamesh can. And so Gilgamesh doesn't attain immortality, but rather the snake does. And this is apparently symbolic of how snakes shed their skin. So, you know, they die in one skin and then they're reborn into another skin, which snakes aren't really immortal, by the way. It's all just bloody snake propaganda. But this idea also appears in Chinese legends, in Indian legends, and Islamic, European, African, just basically all over the entire world. And it's often linked to magic, mysticism, alchemy, and gods or, you know, divine creatures. And this entry is actually a little different to the previous ones, in that we actually do know exactly where this is located. And that is right here in this glass. Immortality. And I will be giving a single drop of this Elixir of Life to everyone who subscribes. So, 1 subscribe for 1 life of eternity. Pretty even trade, I would say. Or don't, but don't say I didn't offer. In tier 5, we have the Holy Prepuce. The Holy Prepuce is Jesus's circumcised bits. 2,000-year-old skin from down there. Lovely. But the first records of this claim come from the 800s, when this was presented to Pope Leo III, allegedly being a gift delivered by an angel. And throughout the years, as with many other artifacts, other people, other places, churches, countries, etc., have claimed to have either the original one or little bits of it, little pieces, with as many as 18 different places claiming to have pieces of this, which it's like, how do you even break something this small up into 18 pieces? I'm just like, how? But in 1983, the Holy Prepuce was stolen, and I don't know why someone would, but it was never recovered, and so we don't know where it is to this day. The Brazen Head. So this is kind of a cool thing of legends. It's this kind of automaton AI thing, and it's like a living thing, but also not really. Kind of maybe like a robot or a golem. But this Brazen Head was something in legends that was built like a machine, or it was summoned or generated with magic or mysticism depending on the legend, or by using some sort of science like perhaps a Frankenstein sort of tale, or Frankenstein's monster, or in some legends kind of a bit of both. It was often written as being made of either bronze or brass, and it would reply to any questions you asked it, but would only be able to respond with either a yes or no answer. The legends go back as far as the 12th century, and continue, especially among alchemists, to this current day, but no physical or serious account or evidence for them has ever been found. But I would love to see them exist. They sound so cool. The Seer Stones are these mystical divine stones that have apparently been used by seers and magicians and mystic type people over the years. But I think the most notable, maybe the most famous example of a seer stone would be by the founder of the Latter-day Saints during the translation of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith. So he apparently discovered his first seer stone in New York in 1822, and this is while he was digging a well. He found the stone, and he apparently used it to translate some text. And what he would do is he would take his seer stone, he would put it into a hat, he would kind of cover up all the light, he would look into the hat, and from the Seer Stone, he would see these, visions or revelations or like information that he could learn. And with that, he was able to dictate or transcribe the Book of Mormon. There were a few different stones that he personally used, but by far his most famous one, his favorite one, was this brown one that he found in the well. And it is kept under the protection of the LDS Church and has been since the times of Joseph Smith. The many other stones he had and used, however, are seemingly completely lost, or we just don't know where they are. Alkahest / Azoth. So Azoth is kind of a combination or a mix of like the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life. Its name derives from the Arabic for the word mercury, being al-zabak, and originally described this hypothetical liquid that could, transform mercury into gold or silver, but it kind of transformed and evolved over the years, the myth of this thing, and over the years it seemingly got more and more abilities, more and more properties, until it could, cure all illnesses, extend life, even, bring people back from the dead. And it could even enlighten people, raise them up to a higher level, a higher plane of understanding or enlightenment, kind of like Victor from Arcane. And no one has really properly claimed or discovered this yet. Over the years there were some accounts of this kind of existing, but they're often thought to just be representations of it or stories, and there's no one really that claims in the modern day to have possession of this. But that doesn't mean that it can't exist. Hihi'irokane is this crazy mythical metal in Japanese legends that's supposedly red, flame-colored, is lighter than gold, and yet stronger than diamonds. It is considered extremely rare, extremely valuable. It can boil water just by sitting in it, and it has been used in a few fantasy settings over the years, like for example Scarletite in Final Fantasy, which is pretty cool. It was apparently more common in, days of old, and was used to build all these mythical weapons and tools and armors, but has been slowly losing its power, or just the volume of these metals gets lost over time, so it became a thing of legends. And the 3 sacred treasures of Japan, for example, were said to be made from this metal, which, those treasures in and of themselves should be on this list because they're mysterious as all get out. But as well as those other properties, this metal apparently can't rust, and it is a great conductor of both heat and emotions, souls, and the metal itself is said to be the last remnants of this great worldwide Japanese empire from billions of years ago. And that's a pretty long time ago. That's like before the dinosaurs. But there's no further evidence for this one. We're not sure if it ever did exist, and we're even less sure of a billion-year-old Japanese worldwide empire. But if you do find any, then drop me a little message down below, as I would love to smelt it down and make a mug out of it. Toadstones were these cool little stones that were found and revered for seemingly thousands of years, with one of the first ever mentions of these stones dating back to the year 77. And that's not 1977, literally the year 77, which is a long time ago. But these stones were smooth, they were kind of perfect, and they were used in both jewelry as well as practical purposes, because they were said to hold mystical abilities and properties. They were said to cure illnesses, treat diseases, and just all round spread good vibes. And they were called toadstones because they were said or rumored to grow inside the heads of toads, which is probably not true. They were or are likely these fossilized fish teeth from the Shinsteer, this thing, which is kind of part cool, part creepy, part beautiful, part disturbing. But yeah, do they treat poison? Probably not. I wouldn't recommend it. Just go to a doctor or something. But do they look cool? Absolutely. Templar Treasures. So this is a super interesting topic that involves the Knights Templar from the 12th century, and one of the first interesting things I learnt about them quite a while back was that only around 10% of the order were actually knights. I know, it's like knight is literally in their name, but 90% of the Knights Templar aren't actually knights. The rest were like middle management, or they were in religious roles or financial roles, because as well as being a huge fighting force, Horse, they were also incredibly wealthy. They set up things like banks, they put out loans, they managed debts, and they traded in money, they traded in products, so stuff like merchanting, and in building things, in construction projects. They were pretty huge. And when knights signed up to this order, they had to transfer all of their money and possessions over to the order, and then swear a vow of poverty, chastity, piety, and obedience to the order, and to conquer the Holy Lands. And in exchange for all of that, they were promised bread, water, and the poor clothing of the house, and also much pain and suffering, which, yeah, sign me up. Sounds like a fantastic deal. And a bunch of the places that either the Knights Templar used or that they built are still to this day called something to do with Templar, temple, that sort of thing. Like, for example, the Temple Bar in London, or the Temple Church or Station, also in London, as well as many, many more of these throughout Europe. But the order was very powerful, as I said, very rich, getting richer and richer by the year, and eventually they grew too big for their own boots, and the order was shut down and subsequently persecuted. And as they were being persecuted, they basically split off. Bunch of them fled. They took almost all of their treasures, their gold, their valuables, and we don't really know what they did with a lot of it. There are rumors that say it was either confiscated secretly by the church, or, the rulers of that time, or people say that the Templars, buried it somewhere in Europe, or that they took it and went up to Scotland, because they had quite a few good, rich friends up in Scotland who were probably willing to protect them. And then from there, they either buried it in Scotland, or even sailed over to the New World, because Scotland had some connection with the Vikings, and the Vikings were known for having traveled actually over to America. So with Scottish protection, with the maps and ships and abilities of the Vikings, this is one of the big theories that they took all of the treasure, all of the gold, took it on these ships over to America, over to the New World, and then buried it over there, eventually assimilating into the local people and basically forgetting where they put it, which has led to theories like the buried treasure in Oak Island, which we covered in the Unsolved Mystery Iceberg. So a fascinating mystery. We have basically no idea where their treasures are, where they were put, where they were buried or kept or anything like that. And the topic of the Templars goes super, super deep if you want to read into it, which I highly recommend that you do. Joan of Arc's sword. So this is a fascinating little piece of history regarding, well, Joan of Arc's sword. And she apparently found this sword by, listening to these voices, by following these vibes, and it led her behind an altar at the Saint Catherine de Fierbois. And in the ground, buried, covered in rust, was this sword. So she dug it up, she removed the rust, and apart from the sword bearing these 5 crosses designed on the blade, we don't know how long it was, how wide it was, the weight of it, or really any of the other design details. And apparently it wasn't too unusual to find buried swords, because a lot of warriors did bury their swords for whatever reason, either to retire the sword or for some sort of blessing, which also brings up kind of an additional mystery in this as to who the sword originally actually belonged to. Some say it belonged to Charlemagne's father, Charles Martel, who fought off the Muslim invasion in Europe in the Middle Ages, and so the legend says that Charles buried his sword and that it would be dug up by the next person destined to defend France. And that, apparently, according to the legends, was Joan of Arc. And she herself is a fascinating figure, but we'll perhaps get into that another time. And she never really used this sword as a sword in a way. Being Puppycat, used the sword as a sword. But it was old, clearly, it had been rusted, it was most likely blunt, and so she never used it in battle or to kill anyone, but she did use it kind of as a symbol of power, and also to, chase people away, to bonk them on the heads. But before she was killed, she refused to say where she buried it, or where she had hidden it, or where she had kept it, and still to this day, it has not been found. The Hand of Glory was this old tradition, I guess, of cutting off the left hand of someone who was hanged for murder and pickling the hand drying it out, and then this resulted in the Hand of Glory. Gross. But then they went one step further, and they extracted the fat from this hanged person and turned it into wax, into a candle. And apparently, if you made a candle out of it and then slotted it into the Hand of Glory, some very interesting things would happen. Whenever you lit the candle, it would freeze the person in front of it, which they're probably just freezing because they're terrified of how much of a psycho you are. Or you could also upgrade this by taking some hairs from the hanged person and using them in the candle as a wick. And then this upgraded Hand of Glory would illuminate everything, but only for the holder. So you could walk around at nighttime, you could see everything with this candle, but no one else could see the light, giving you some sort of pseudo invisibility, or so the legends say. It was also able to unlock any doors that you presented the hand to, which is a very handy, pun intended, ability to have. But we're not really hanging people anymore these days. It's kind of out of fashion, so the amount of these Hands of Glories is kind of slowly going down over the years. But yeah, let me know below what you think about this one. Tier 6, Drake's Drum. So this is a drum that Sir Francis Drake had with him, during his expeditions traveling around the world. And in the 1500s, on his last expedition, on his deathbed, he apparently ordered that this drum be immediately shipped back and returned to England, and that if England was ever in need, that they should just play the drum and it would summon Sir Francis Drake, which sounds like an awesome plot for a film if it hasn't been done already. But the drum was taken back to Buckland Abbey, or Drake's family home, and has seemingly remained there ever since, under protection, and I guess for security reasons, as it is so fragile. We don't know exactly where it is kept. We know it's probably kept somewhere here in England, in this area sort of thing, but it's all kept incredibly vague. There are a few replicas that have been made and displayed over the years, and apparently these are quite accurate, so you can kind of see what it looks like, or at least what it did look like. But as to the location of the actual drum, we don't really know, but it is probably in safe hands. And according to legend, it was said to have been heard in multiple places at multiple times, and these times were kind of important to the English nation, such as the departure of the Mayflower in 1620, or Napoleon's arrival as prisoner, Plymouth Harbor, the start of World War I, the surrender of the German Navy, and also in a few major events in World War II. And if anyone does try to play this drum or beat it, it may just turn to dust. So I don't know how Sir Francis Drake expects us to summon him, but it is what it is. Lyngurium. So this was this mythical gemstone that was often listed in medieval texts. These ancient European bestiaries. And yes, they're called bestiaries, not bestiaries for some reason. But these were these huge encyclopedias, often illustrated. They had lists of beasts of gems, of rocks, and with all this detail about each one. And they must honestly at the time have been pretty cool. But this gem was said to be made from the solidified urine of lynxes, which is pretty gross. And these gems could apparently cure any ailments, could cure diseases. They could attract various types of metals, put one on a stick and try and locate the metal or something. And the best ones were made by wild lynxes and also by male lynxes, because of course they were. And in a lot of these entries, the lynxes were noted as hiding these gems from humans, hiding gems made from their own solidified urine just to spite the humans, I guess. They're like, no, we don't want you humans to have them. And so they swallowed them to keep the humans from benefiting from their powers. Pretty wild, but it is an interesting piece of ancient history. The Sudarium of Oviedo, or the Shroud of Oviedo, is this veil or cloth said to be wrapped around Jesus' head when he had died. It is currently stored in the Cathedral of San Salvador in Spain, in this kind of chest of sorts, and it is displayed 3 times every year. Once on Good Friday, once on September the 14th, and once on September the 21st, and is thought to be of the same origin as the Shroud of Turin, with both cloths apparently showing traces of the blood type AB, and both of them showing similar blood patterns. And the cloth was allegedly taken from the empty tomb by Jesus' followers, and kept somewhere. We don't really have any records of it. But the next mention of it is in the year 570 AD. So like 500 years later, when it was being kept in a cave nearby Jerusalem. And then from there, it was taken to Egypt. And then from Egypt along North Africa. And then across the Mediterranean over into Spain, where it resides to this day. The Sword of Victory, or the, and I'm gonna completely screw this up, but the Fra Sankanchaisi, I am terribly sorry, but this is a royal sword that represents the power and authority of the Thai royalty, and it is honestly a pretty beautiful sword. It is made out of iron, with the whole thing being packaged in these cool looking gems. You know, part of it's made from quartz, gold, sapphires, rubies, and it was discovered in 1957 in the crypt of Wat Aracha Borana. But as to its true original origins, where it actually came from, we don't really know. Some say it was found by a fisherman in the 1700s and then presented to King Rama I as a gift, but that doesn't explain where it came from either. Some say it dates all the way back to the Sukhothai Empire, which was in the 1100s and then was passed down generation to generation. And others say it was gifted by the divine, gifted by the gods, and that's where it originally came from, which further proves and emphasizes the royalty's right to rule, their divinity, their power, etc. It does have a few mystical properties, apparently, allegedly, and the story goes that when it was brought into the city of Bangkok, 7 lightning strikes hit the city, which apparently symbolized and signified this sword's immense power. As I said, it is a super beautiful sword, and it is kind of fascinating to think, to imagine, you know, where it actually came from, where it was made, who made it, when they made it, and yeah, these are all very good questions. The Cup of Jamshid. So this was this legendary Persian artifact, believed to have these magical, mythical, divine properties, such as divination, you know, seeing into the future, seeing events that haven't happened yet, or psychic knowledge, or some form of scrying, so seeing places where you currently are not. Or this cup was said to contain something akin to, you know, the Elixir of Life. It would heal people, it would make people immortal, bring them back from the dead. And it was written about a ton in like the 10th century in Persian and Eastern poems, stories, manuscripts. So it goes quite far back. It's been talked about quite a bit, but we have no evidence to say whether it existed or not, and whether it exists to this day. The gold train of the bad guys from World War II. And once again, it's stupid that I have to censor that, but it is what it is. But this was a train purportedly filled with gold and jewelry and, you know, rare treasures and all sorts. And towards the end of World War II, when the Germans knew that they were kind of losing the war, they apparently moved this train secretly to this underground secret train bunker and moved it way deep underground, sealed everything off, collapsed the tunnels, and this was apparently in southwest Poland. And after the war, no one ever found it. It was said to contain a huge 300 tons worth of valuables, which is just insane. So obviously a bounty that big has, you know, attracted some attention, generated some legends. And the Polish army during the Cold War even did like these extensive searches for this train, but they never ended up finding it. And in 2015, 2 men claimed to have found this train. As they were using these underground radars, they apparently detected something that was kind of train shaped, and so the Polish military came in. They started this huge dig, but eventually found that these images on the radar were just kind of train-shaped rock formations. Very sad, I know. But this train, full of 300 tons worth of treasures, gold, might be buried somewhere out there and might still one day be found. The Gates of Alexander. So these were these great gates, these fortifications that Alexander the Great apparently built. And these were to keep out the barbarians from the north, or from southern Siberia. And they were said to be the great dividing line between the civilized world and the barbaric world. And the evidence for this one is a little unclear. There were a few mentions of other passes over the years, you know, from the Derbent Pass to the Darial Pass to the Great Gorgon Wall, the Caspian Pass, etc. And while we do have references to these, they're often kind of conflated and confused with one another. And so we have a few, for example, that Alexander the Great is actually credited with building, but then we found out it was built 600 years after Alexander Alexander, so there is some confusion on this whole topic, but we still don't know exactly to what the Gates of Alexander is referring, or where it's located, or rather where it was located. But all mysteries aside, it was very likely just a great wall with some great fortifications. The story of Alexander the Great is just insane. There are a few really cool videos out there if you want to check out the whole story. But yeah, were the gates built and then later destroyed? Were they just confused with another wall or another gate? Were they perhaps buried somehow? We don't really know, but I will leave a link to a very, very cool video down in the description that basically covers the entire life and conquest and adventure, etc. of Alexander the Great. The Curtana, or the Sword of Mercy, is a sword that's one of the British crown jewels and is used in the coronation of new kings and queens. Not that there's been too many of them recently, but that is partly what it's used for. It has a blunted blade and a squared tip to represent mercy, and my lord is it a gorgeous sword. And the history for the origin of this sword is a little debated. It first appeared in records from like the 1200s as Curtana or Curtane, some variation of that, and this was during Henry III's wedding. And it can be seen here having more of a kind of jaggedy tip, which represented more, I guess, like the tip of a sword snapped off, rather than what it is today, like a cleanly cut end of the sword. And so it originally looked like this before it was squared off. Some legends say that it originally belonged to Sir Tristan, one of the Knights of the Round Table, because there was a receipt written by King John, or rather signed by King John, in the year 1207 for the storing of one Tristram's or Tristan's sword. And Tristan's sword in these legends was said to have a broken off tip, because when he was in battle with the giant Irish warrior Morholt, he apparently got his sword lodged into Morholt's skull, and then it broke off the tip. So there is a theory that this was actually Tristan's sword, broken tip and all, and it has been kept and passed down through the generations. Or there is a theory that says that this originally belonged to Edward the Confessor of England, and this was all the way back in the 11th century, and whose death kind of sparked the Norman French invasion of England. But we don't really know officially where it came from, or who made it, or when, but it does remain a very cool, if not mysterious sword. Tier 7, the Emerald Tablet. So this text likely found in the 1st century by a man named Belinus, who was a Greek philosopher, and he said that he found this Emerald Tablet in this cave, and this was inside of a hidden chamber within the cave. And there was, according to the legend, this old man lying there, or rather this skeleton of an old man, because he was a skeleton, he wasn't a person, and skeletons are people, or at least they used to be people, and I've completely complicated this. But basically there was a skeleton lying there with something in its hand, and this something apparently was the Emerald Tablet. And according to the legend, he took this tablet, he translated it, he stored it, kept it, brought it out, moved it around, stored it again, until over the years of this constant moving, translating, storing, etc., it was basically lost and almost forgotten about. It is now kind of a thing of myth and legends. We don't have the original copy, and that is if it ever actually did exist itself. And there have been many, many translations and versions of this Emerald Tablet, with it mainly being a alchemical document, with its author often being believed to be Hermes Trismegistus, which was kind of a ancient mix or fusion between the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, as often Hermes was the god of speaking, of messages, of languages, etc. And the chamber that this tablet was, apparently according to legend, found in was under a temple dedicated to Hermes. So the idea is that maybe the skeleton was a devout person of Hermes, or a follower of him. Hermes wrote this tablet, gave it down to this person. Maybe they were alive when they received it, maybe they were already a skeleton, and it was intended to teach all of humans about alchemy and all about a bunch of cool other stuff. Sadly, as I said, no physical copy of this remains, and we don't know if it ever existed, we don't know what originally was written in it, and no one was ever able to use or utilize the information in it to, transform anything into gold, to create the Philosopher's Stone, for example. So we kind of squandered that gift from Hermes. The Sibylline Books. So these were these books of prophecy, purchased by the last king of Rome, Lucius Malfoy. No, I'm only kidding. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. And I just love these old Roman names. But this was in around the year 500 BC. And as the story goes, he was approached by a Sibyl, which was like a female prophesizer sort of thing. You know, she saw the future, she saw prophecies, and she offered him 9 books of prophecies for a very high price. He then declined this trade. He said, you know, either I don't want them or it's too pricey. So she was like, alright, fine. She went away, burnt 3 of the books, and then returned to him, offering the remaining 6 books for the same very high price. He once again apparently said no, so she went away again, burnt 3 more, came back to him with the same offer. So the books at this point were 3 times as expensive, but I guess afraid that he was going to lose all of this knowledge, he ended up purchasing these 3 books, and these are the Sibylline Books. But he did buy them and kept them in a secret vault below the Temple of Jupiter in Rome, and they were taken out every now and then to be read, to be interpreted, to be like kind of horoscopes or fortune cookies. And when they had a plague, when they were fighting a war, when they couldn't make a decision, they would, you know, sometimes go through these books and use their revelations in order to help guide them. And this was until the temple was more or less destroyed in 83 BC. So after that, more kinds of versions, copies of these were produced until they were later fully destroyed in the year 405, and this was by General Flavius Stilicho, and he ordered them destroyed because I think he thought that they were kind of threatening his authority. You know, maybe he told them to go do something and then they were like, oh yeah, okay, let us just check the books. And then he was just sick of these books, so he just destroyed them. And these books were written in the Greek hexameter verse, with some examples of this being Sing Goddess, the anger of Achilles, Peleus' son, or Over the Sea, past Crete, on the Syrian shore to the southward. But although we know of the existence of these books, we don't actually have any idea what was in them, because they were known, but they were never like brought out for the public to see, or even had their contents copied or written down. Because if you think about it, if that ever got out into the public, or even worse, to, you know, enemy states, to enemy countries, if they knew some of your prophecies, if they knew your horoscopes, they could potentially predict what you might do in a certain scenario. And obviously this would be a bad thing. So yeah, we have no idea what was in these books, we have no idea what was written, and they were destroyed seemingly for all eternity. Kind of reminds me of the Library of Alexandria, and the loss of information makes me very sad. Hihi'irokane. So if you haven't heard of Beowulf, it was this epic poem, this story more or less, that was written around the year 700 in modern day England. But the story within the poem takes place long before this, in mainly Sweden, Denmark and Frisia, or this area of northern Germany / the Netherlands. And in this epic tale, the King of Danes is basically attacked and threatened by this great monster, Grendel, who comes in, attacks his people, attacks his settlements, destroys a bunch of stuff, and notably attacks the king's mead hall, Hihi'irokane. Then, spoilers, Beowulf kills Grendel and saves the day, but people have started to question the origin of the mead hall Hihi'irokane. So was it just completely made up? Was it made up but inspired by some other hall? Or was it actually based on a real hall that they knew about at the time? Now, we haven't uncovered where it was, or even any archaeological evidence of the beer hall itself, or rather the mead hall, but one contender for potentially being an inspiration for this hall was the Hearty Hall on the Isle of Sheppey, which apparently was known as Hihi'irokane in its time, or it was one of the great halls in Denmark, specifically Lyra, which digs and searches around this area have shown evidence of these Viking halls that date back to like the year 600-700. But the hall itself was absolutely epic in the story, and it actually inspired J.R.R. Tolkien in, you know, his Lord of the Rings, and served as inspiration for the Golden Hall of King Theoden, as well as inspiring many other themes in many other stories, such as Vikings and Game of Thrones. Q Source, also sometimes called the Sayings Gospel, or just Q if you're really cool, but this was a hypothetical document that scholars believe was the source for some of the biblical writings, and it's fairly conventionally believed that the writings of Matthew and Luke were written after the Book of Mark, and they used the Book of Mark for some of their inspiration. But there are also a bunch of sayings from Jesus that appear in Matthew and Luke that don't appear in Mark, meaning that they likely used a second source, to draw some of these sayings from, but it can't have been Mark because these sayings weren't actually in Mark. And we have never been able to identify or locate this secondary source. Scholars think that perhaps the books of Matthew and Luke took enough of the contents of this source. They copied this source so well. All of the sayings were in Matthew and Luke, and people liked the way that these books interpreted the sayings. So people just started to use the books of Matthew and Luke as a source for these sayings. So people didn't really need the original source anymore. It kind of fell out of popularity. It stopped being copied. And all we have is Matthew and Luke. But what this original source was, where it came from, who wrote it, what exactly it contained, is the massive mystery here. It was apparently just Jesus' sayings, quotes from Jesus, parables, and they were divided into wisdom sayings and judgment sayings, and also some narrative ones. And some of the things believed to have come from this source are, for example, the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, and many, many other parables. Nehushtan was, and this is kind of funny because the name itself is most likely a pun, either on the Hebrew word for snake, or for brass, or for both. And it was this bronze serpent statue that Moses built with instruction from the Lord, and he placed it on a stick. Now, to add some context for this, the Israelites were basically turning away from God, turning away from Moses, and so God sent down these snakes to bite and kill them. And then they were all bitten, poisoned, they were dying, and they seemingly repented. They turned back towards Moses and God, and then God instructed Moses. He said, create this bronze snake statue, put it on a stick, hold it up for all the Israelites to see, and whosoever looks upon this statue will be cured. And so he did that. A bunch of the Israelites were cured, and the statue was actually kept until King Hezekiah later destroyed it, because he said the Israelites were now worshipping this statue and, giving offerings to it, saying prayers to it, and so worshipping anything other than God or Yahweh was clearly a big no-no. But the idea of a snake on a staff, wrapped around a staff, and especially one that is kind of healthy, cures ailments or injuries or diseases, is a very old concept, with origins even older than the Bible, with one of the Mesopotamian gods, Ningishzida, using a staff with two snakes coiled around it. And this was potentially as far back as 4000 BC, so like 6000 years ago, and we still use this symbol today in hospitals, A&E places, doctors, etc. So a super ancient concept. It goes back at least 6,000 years. Very likely it goes back in the oral tradition to 10,000, 15,000 or more years ago. And it was in the Bible, and we still use it today. So yeah, some great continuity. The Seal of Solomon was thought very likely to be a ring made out of brass and iron. And King Solomon of Israel used this ring apparently for several means. The ring allegedly was absolutely beautiful. It was engraved with the words, "Most Great Name of God." It was decorated with these 4 precious gems that represented Solomon's control over the 4 elements, and allowed Solomon to communicate with and control spirits and stuff like demons, genies, and to grant protection and safety to people, and speak with animals like Dr. Dolittle, and perform rituals. It was really like a jack-of-all-trades ring. But we don't have any physical evidence that the ring existed. It's in legends, it's in accounts, it's been written about, but we don't have anything that resembles the ring on hand physically. And again, with a lot of these, maybe it was destroyed over time, maybe it was just lost, forgotten, buried under the ground, or maybe it's at the bottom of a lake somewhere, bottom of a river, but it remains one of the most mysterious, seemingly powerful objects or artifacts in history. And that is all we have time for. This was a very fun one for myself. As you know, I like all stuff to do with history, ancient people, ancient civilizations, and also myths, legends, artifacts, magic, alchemy. So this one was incredibly fun to do. If you know any cool artifacts that I didn't cover in this one, let me know down below, and perhaps there might be a second episode to this. In case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. And as always, thanks for watching.